How do you study Chinese when you're busy with other things? How do you cope with a Chinese course that is too hard for you? And are translated texts okay to use for reading practice? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. This is episode 52, which means that we have now had one episode per week for a year. And we're going to celebrate that by answering some listener questions. Before I do that though, I would like to thank everybody who has tuned in during this year, and I would also be so bold as to ask you for a favor. If you listened to the podcast and liked it, I would appreciate it greatly if you recommend it to other students or teachers who might be interested, or if you're willing to write a review on your favorite podcasting platform. That would help other people find out about the podcast and hopefully make Chinese a little bit easier and more enjoyable to learn. So, in this episode, we are going to talk about listener questions. And I've chosen 3 questions that were sent in to me, and if you have questions you want to send in, you can send them to editor@hackingchinese.com, and I might do a follow-up Q&A session later. People who sent in more direct questions with simple answers, I just answer directly instead, and I also have a question and answer article already called 101 Questions and Answer About How to Learn Chinese, where I give very concise answers to questions that I get all the time, so you can check that one out as well. The 3 questions I've chosen don't have straightforward or easy answers, and my goal here is not only to answer the question itself, which I will try to do, but I will also talk around the questions to try to answer other questions that listeners might have in that same area. Naturally, I can't say everything there is to say about every question, and sometimes I will refer to articles that I've written before, but the aim here is to give an answer that is helpful for the person who asked the question and also for other people who listen. So let's get into the first question, which is an email from a student called YK, and they say that they are an accountant working full-time and also studying things related to accountancy on the side. And on top of this, they are also learning Chinese. Their question is more specifically about reading, but the same things apply for studying in general, so I'm going to talk about studying Chinese while being busy. They also ask how much time is needed to learn and how much time they should spend. And let's start with the easy bit first. So how much time should you spend or how much time is needed? These things are impossible to answer. Well, of course, how much time you should spend is always as much as possible, and the more time you spend, the more you will learn. But this is naturally constrained by other things, such as working full-time in this case. You might have a family, other hobbies, things you do. As much as possible is the answer, and I'm sorry that's not very helpful, but that's the way it is. And the same goes for how much you need in order to reach some level. Then we need to specify that level, we need to see where you are at now and so on. But in general, obviously it depends on what you want to achieve. If you want to read at a native level, then that takes many years, whereas if you want to be able to read basic text, that can be achieved in a much, much shorter time. If you're studying Chinese while being busy, the first thing that you need to realize is that learning Chinese or learning a language is not like learning other subjects in school. So it's not something you do in a fixed period of time, say between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. on Thursdays. Well, you might have courses or tutoring lessons or something where you do that too, but that is not the whole of language learning, or it definitely shouldn't be at least. Many people still think about it that way, and that is what I want to address here. The reason that that doesn't work is that it will severely limit the amount of time you have available, and if you are busy with work and so on, you are unlikely to be able to fit in more than a few hours of this in a week. And that is not enough if you want to make serious progress with Chinese. Obviously, if you go at it for long enough and you study a few hours per week, you will make progress. I'm not saying you won't, but it's the wrong way to look at the problem. I usually explain this by something I call the time barrel, which you can easily find if you search on Hacking Chinese, for example. There's an article about this. And the idea is that you have a barrel that kind of represents the time you have available. Now, if you were to put everything that you do into this barrel, and you do it in the shape of rocks of different sizes, work, for example, would be a very big rock. There might be other hobbies, smaller rocks, family commitments, could be rocks of any sizes, actually. And other things you're doing, such as learning Chinese, the barrel will fill up very quickly, But the point is that there will still be a lot of space available in the barrel in between all the big things that you're doing. And if you're thinking about learning Chinese in chunks of, say, an hour at a time, there will be a lot of time that you don't use. So what you should do is look at the time you have available and see how can you use that to learn Chinese. And you can do this for every single minute of a day, although you can of course rule out certain periods of the day that you know that you won't be able to get anything done, such as if you're having meetings with people or if you're talking with someone or socially or something like that. But don't rule this out too quickly. There are many situations where you feel you might not be able to do anything, but where you actually can. So listening, for example, is something that fits in almost anywhere, and you can get hours of listening done without actually spending extra time. You can listen while you commute, while you exercise, while you cook, while you do the dishes, and so on. There are so many situations where you can listen, but you might not be able to do anything else. If you use your phone to review vocabulary, for example, you can do that for 5 minutes while you're waiting for something in a queue somewhere or something like that. And there are many opportunities to learn that when you start looking for them, you will see that you actually have quite a lot of time available, even though it might not feel like that at first. And another concept that I think is useful here is time quality, and that simply refers to how much you can do with a given period of time. So, for example, that hour on Thursday morning when you really can study Chinese, that's very high time quality. You could do anything. You can practice speaking, reading, you can look stuff up, you can have a tutoring lesson, you can do anything. And that is time of very high quality then. But then when you commute, for example, quality is not as high because it's tricky, for example, to have a tutoring lessons while on a bus. And if you are, say, walking outside, time quality is even lower because, for example, you cannot practice handwriting while walking around. Or at least I strongly suggest that you don't, as it can be quite dangerous. So the takeaway here is, of course, not that it's dangerous to not see where you're going. The point is that you should be aware of time quality when you decide what to do when. On Thursday mornings between 8 and 9, when you have time, you definitely should not practice listening ability, because you can do that while you're out walking. And you shouldn't do handwriting then either, because you can do that while you commute. And when you commute, sure, you can listen if you don't feel like reading or doing something else, but you shouldn't do it too much, considering that you can get all that listening done while doing other things, during which periods it would be impossible to do, say, handwriting or reading. And if you want some very easily applicable advice based on all that, just write down the things you think you ought to be doing and schedule the things that are hardest to get done first. And then you use the extra time to slot in all the other things. And since listening is very important, but it's definitely not the hardest thing to get done, so listening will typically be left until last, and then you can combine it with all these other activities we just talked about. If you find it extremely difficult to practice writing or, say, having pronunciation practice or something like that, you should schedule those first to make sure that they get done, and they will then automatically use up the time slots with the highest time quality. So to summarize, most people have more time available for learning than they think, and unless you've really looked at your time, for example, written down everything you've done for a day or two, and gone through the list and thought about every instance and what you can and cannot do here in terms of learning Chinese, you probably have much more time available for learning than you think. And if you gradually build up habits like listening during walks or when you exercise or something, or reviewing characters for 5 minutes while waiting for the bus or something like that, you can get an awful lot of things done without investing large blocks of time every day. So the next question is almost the opposite, actually. It is from Mark, who also contacted me by email, and he says that in the autumn he's going to take a Chinese course that is probably going to be very difficult, much, much above his own level. And he wants to do it and says he's motivated to do it, but doesn't really know if he can do it, and if I have any advice for how to approach this. This is a great question, and it's something that I've done deliberately several times, so I think I have a few words of advice here. So what I did a few times while learning Chinese in Taiwan was that I went to different language schools to learn, and I tried to get into the hardest class they would put me in. Because I realized early on that I was not in the same position as most of my classmates, and that I therefore didn't want to be in a class that was kind of on my level. And the reason was that most people were in the situation that YK is in. they study other subjects, they teach English, they work with other things on the side, and so on. But I was only studying Chinese, and I had a lot of time, and I wanted to learn as much as possible. And generally speaking, being in an environment where people speak more Chinese, where people are better than you, is quite beneficial. You can learn a lot from that. It's also the case that you will get used to a higher level after a while, provided that it is within reasonable reach of your current level, of course. If a beginner enrolls in, say, a graduate school program for native speakers, that's not going to work. But if you're a lower intermediate learner and you enroll in an upper intermediate course, that could work out if you just give it enough time and energy. We humans are very good at adjusting to a new linguistic environment, and you will be able to do so as well. The minimum required effort is much, much higher, so provided that you survive, you will definitely learn more than if you enroll in a much easier program. Of course, it depends on where you're studying, but in my experience, you can usually argue your way into a more difficult class. So the way it usually works is that you might take a small test, or you might talk to someone, you do an interview or something before they place you at a certain level. So you go to class and see what it's like. And if you think that it is on your level, but you know that you will be able to spend lots more time than everybody else, or if you just want a challenge, you should try to contact the teacher or maybe the headmaster or someone who is responsible and try to argue that you should be put in a higher class. That has worked for me every single time. You just need to be humble about it. You say that you want to really do this. You say that you have enough time. You know it's going to be difficult and you will work as hard as you can, and so on and so forth. Maybe you even contact a teacher who teaches in a more advanced class and talk with them, or you ask them, can I at least talk to the teacher, and you can present your case. And that has worked for me so far, at least. I'm not guaranteeing that it will work every time, obviously, but it is something you can try if you want to. The downside of this is, of course, that it is incredibly demanding. You have to have the time, you have to have the energy, and you have to know that you can maintain these for a few months. The first weeks, or possibly the first month, will be very tiring, and you will feel like you're maybe not learning much, maybe not understanding much, and until you get past that hump, it will be a pain. And if you're not willing to do that and willing to endure that, you shouldn't do it. Count on having to work much more than the other people in your class, and you should count on being the worst in class all the time. Naturally, learning a language is not a competition. You only care about your own progress. You don't care about if you're better or worse than other people in your class. And the idea here is, of course, that you will be worst, but you will still be much better than if you stayed in the easier class. You also need to be aware of the fact that your grades might suffer, of course. If you skip classes or you go up too many levels at once, the content will be very difficult and you stand little or no chance of passing with good grades. This is something you need to be aware of. You should probably talk to the teacher if you care about your grades and so on to see if this is even a good idea. But if you're only after the language learning and you have the time and energy, I'd recommend that you do this. It can be extremely rewarding. So let's talk about how to do this then. I mean, you have the time and the energy, so how do you spend it? So let's look at a few things you can do as a student if you're in a class that is actually way too hard for you. So the first thing is to know that you should prepare a lot. So here are things you should do before the lesson. Learn the basic meaning of vocabulary before you go to class. This is kind of essential and pretty obvious, but you will not only need to learn the vocabulary that you're going to cover in class, you will also have to learn everything else that the other people already know. And that can maybe double the amount of vocabulary you have to learn. And the idea here is not that you master the vocabulary, how to use it and so on. That would be quite difficult to do on your own and also under time pressure. But what you should do is that you should make sure that you know these words, at least their basic meaning, what they sound like and what they look like and so on. And this is something you can easily do on your own. Preferably, you should start doing this several days before the class. You don't start like the day before or the morning before the lesson. You start a few days before so you have time to see these words a few times, so that when you are in class and listen to other people and your teacher talking about the vocabulary, the sentences, the content in the text and so on, you can at least follow what they are talking about. In the beginning, you might understand nothing else. You might just be able to pick up words here and there, and that's fine. But as long as you have the basic vocabulary, you kind of have the building blocks you need to make sense of everything. Whereas if you don't have the vocabulary, you stand little or no chance to understand anything, and even if you persist, you might understand very little. I also suggest that you listen to the text in advance as much as you can, and that you also read it. The goal here again is not to make sure you understand everything, but it is to be as familiar with it as possible. And when you listen to it, put it on your phone, listen to it a few times. Maybe you don't understand that much the first times, but when you've gone through the vocabulary a little bit, you listen again, maybe you read a little bit as support, you will at least know what the text is about and have some structure. And this scaffolding is extremely important for when you get into class, where you can then benefit from going to class. Because if you don't do all these things, going to class is not going to give you next to anything at all. While you're doing these things, look things up, write down any questions you might have, look up the grammar, answer preview questions if there are such, or discussion questions. Do what you can to kind of get into the right mindset so you're as prepared as possible for going into class. Because the point then when you get to class is not that you are there to learn the basics. You already know all the basics here. And it's likely that your classmates don't. And it's usually the case that the more advanced they are, the more lax they are when it comes to preparing. So the best students might be those who are worst prepared. And that means that in class, they will talk about the words, they will discuss how to use them, they will talk about what happens in the book, some discussion questions, and so on. And they will do that based on the fact that not everybody knows everything. But since you've studied all the basics, you can use all this input you get to actually kind of really learn all these words and get to the roughly same level of understanding as the other people. Of course, this is going to be very hard. Like I said, in the beginning, it's likely that you might not understand anything at all. I've been to many, many Chinese classes where I understand something like 30% of what the teacher says. Only occasional words here and there. But then after a month, sometimes half the semester, things start falling into place. And if you keep spending the time, you keep listening, you keep reading, and you make sure you know the basic vocabulary and so on, things suddenly start falling into place and you will be at that level. Of course, you might not catch up entirely to people who are maybe a semester or two or even like years ahead of you in just one semester, but you will be able to catch up somewhat at least. Morale can be an issue here because you will feel that you are the worst student in class all the time. Everybody else knows so much and your Chinese is so bad. But again, it's not a competition. You are not competing against people in your class. They actually are there to help you. And the better they are, the more you can learn from them, right? So it's actually a good thing for you to be worst. It doesn't feel like that, but hopefully the idea or the knowledge that it is good for you will make it feel slightly less bad. After the lesson, you need to review. Everybody knows that it's important to review, but really, really do it. If you only do what I just said before the lesson and during the lesson, you will learn things and you will be able to follow, but most of these things will fade away and then you have kind of spent some of this time in vain. So make sure you go through old things, make sure you look at any kind of supplementary content if there is extra listening, extra reading and so on. And of course you can also add in other activities, graded readers, podcasts and so on, but it depends on how much time you have, and I would suggest make sure that the stuff that you've spent so much time trying to get familiar with, make sure you review it so you don't lose it. And one final thing that I just mentioned in passing before is that before you do any of this, you should of course have a good talk with the teacher so he or she knows what you're doing, what your attitude is, and so on, because you are going to need help to be able to do this. Now, of course, the teacher will not cater to you too much because they've prepared a course at a certain level and they don't want to suddenly have to teach, two courses, one at the actual level and then extra material for you. Well, some teachers actually might do that, but that is not something you can demand of them or even should ask. What you can do, of course, is to ask them for patience and just to understand what you're doing and what you're going through and so on. And that can be very helpful just to have that moral support. Okay, so that concludes the second question about how to deal with a class that is way too difficult. Let's get into the third question, which is from Rebecca, who has an online reading group where she reads Chinese text, stories, and books and so on with other learners, and they discuss them and they help each other and so on, which is a great idea. That's great for moral support from other students, and I mean, you shouldn't walk the path to fluency on your own. It is much more enjoyable to do so in the company of others. For this question, I'm going to explain the question itself in some detail before I try to approach it. So they are reading a parallel text, and that is a text where you have one language on, say, one page, the left page, for example, and then another language on the other page. In this case, it's Chinese and English. And they are reading a book called 5 on Treasure Island, which is actually a book I read in Swedish when I was, 8 maybe. I really liked these books as a kid, so it's kind of nice to see it pop up here. So the point is that these books are written by Enid Blyton in English. And an English teacher in China has turned them into English learning materials. So it's a book meant for Chinese people to learn English by reading this book, Five on Treasure Island. And then there is also a Chinese version to help them figure out what things mean that they can refer to if they are not sure what the English means. And the question here is, can we use this for learning Chinese? She is concerned that the language is not natural and doesn't sound really Chinese, more like English written with Chinese characters. And she also provided one example here that I'm going to read to you now. 快活起来吧，爸爸说。我敢说，我可以给你们找到同样好玩的地方。不管怎么说，今年我跟妈妈不能跟你们一起去了。妈妈告诉你们了吗？ She also highlighted 3 passages here that she thought were possibly problematic. The first one is 快活起来吧. The second is 我敢说. And the third one is 不管怎么说. So I read these sentences. I also checked them with a native speaker that I trust a lot when it comes to grammaticality judgments and generally assessing natural language. And the answer for this particular sentence is that the start here, 快活起来吧, is not Chinese. It sounds like English written with Chinese characters. This is not an expression that is used in Chinese. I don't know what the original is in English, but maybe something like cheer up or liven up or something. The other 2 are fine. 我敢说, I dare say in English, that works. Maybe it's more common in English than it is in Chinese, but it is a way that people say things in Chinese as well. And the third one is 不管怎么说 also works. Now, this was only a few sentences out of a whole book, and I'm sure there are more sentences like 快活起来吧 in this book. And the question then is, what happens if you read this? Should you read this type of material and risk learning phrases and word usage that actually isn't used in Chinese? And how big of a problem would it be? So let's talk about this by looking a little bit at the process of learning to read Chinese. And we can then separate these into different processes. We have lower level processes, that would be things like character recognition, word segmentation, word recognition, and so on. And here we're simply trying to map meaning onto Chinese characters. And in Chinese, that also requires us to figure out where a word starts and where it ends, because as we all know, we don't have spacing in Chinese. Everything is just written in one long sequence, so we need to do that. We need to be able to connect these with vocabulary that we've learned previously, and so on and so forth. Then we also have higher level processes where we use more advanced cognitive processes such as induction. We're trying to guess things. We're trying to use what we know about the text to figure out what it might be using previous experience and so on. Lots of reading strategies and much more. And all of these things we practice when we read. Even if you're reading a text that has occasional oddities in it, most of these things are roughly the same. The problem, of course, is that when you're reading, you're also trying to build a mental model for how the language works. Or you might not be doing that consciously and intentionally, but your brain collects data and does fairly advanced statistics on what you're reading to gradually figure out what is right, and that finally, at some level, will give you a kind of yugan, this feel for the language. It feels right to have this object after this verb, or this sentence feels wrong to me, and usually you will be right. But of course, if you were to read bad Chinese all the time, maybe you build up a feel for the language that is incorrect. And obviously we don't want to do that, right? So that requires us to talk about this model. What does it mean to be correct? I would say that this can be addressed from 2 different angles, or 2 different categories maybe. The first one is native Chinese written for native speakers. And this would be what's called authentic content. The problem with that is, of course, that it's very time-consuming, expensive, and or difficult to find enough reading material that is both authentic and comprehensible, that you can actually make sense of. So that's not something that most people can just rely on. We simply need texts that are adjusted to us in some way. Or we need scaffolding of some kind, such as having a parallel text, which is what this question is about. Now, when it comes to language to model, we should also recognize that even authentic content might not be consistent, like internally consistent. It might vary quite a lot. Obviously, we have different fangyan or topolects or different regional variants. We also have people from many different areas of China that might write slightly differently, even if they are writing in Mandarin, I mean. People also speak differently depending on their background, their education level, their profession, their gender, and so on and so forth. We also have the fact that people who wrote something 30 years ago obviously don't write the same way people do today. So there's lots of variation within this authentic content area. So it's not like just because it is authentic, it is then consistent and you can learn it without running into this type of problem. Now, of course, what is right and wrong just depends on what standards you use, and it's hard to argue, I think, that native speakers that write things are wrong, provided that they are writing in a way that they think sounds good. The second type of text would be one that has a purpose beyond the language itself, like there is some kind of motive behind writing this that influences language heavily. So, for example, if you write a children's book, you have a specific aim in mind, and that will influence the way you write. If you write a textbook for foreigners, you will also write in a certain way. And here comes the point, if you're writing a translation of a text, obviously the way you write is going to be influenced by the original text, otherwise you are not really making a translation, right? And here I think we can start to be a little bit careful, although we shouldn't necessarily get paranoid. It is certainly the case that there are lots of oddities even in textbooks, for example, and graded readers also have some strange sentences in them. If we look at lower level graded readers, it is very difficult to write things that are both natural and idiomatic in Chinese and sticks to, say, 150 characters. That is very, very hard to do, and it's kind of obvious that the language will suffer a little bit. Now, the more characters or words you're allowed to use, the more natural it can sound. But that is still not a guarantee. However, when it comes to most material for learners that is published fairly recently, i.e. it's not a textbook from 30 years ago, I think you can mostly count on the language in them being accurate. I don't want you to start to doubt everything your textbook says, for example. But it is still worth noting that there are things in textbooks that are definitely wrong, and many teachers say things that are outright wrong as well. I even wrote an article about that a while back called 7 Things You Were Taught in Chinese Class That Are Actually Wrong. And you will often run into people who are very sure that something is wrong or right, and then you ask someone else later and they will say no. They will say the opposite and correct you in the other direction or something. Still, what you should do in these cases, including the actual question here, is that you should ask a native speaker what they think about the text. Ask them to read part of the text or a few pages or something if it's a longer book, and see what they say. Ask them, is this a good text for me to practice my Chinese? And most of the time, such as in this case, you will certainly get people who say that no, people don't say 活起来吧. And they might be able to find dozens of similar examples on the same page even. And if that's the case, I don't think that this book is appropriate reading material. And to see why this is a problem, you need to think about what is the purpose of this text. Well, it is to illustrate for a native Chinese speaker what the English in this book means. And that is radically different from what you are trying to achieve here. And that means, for example, that if we take the 活起来吧, that is meant there as an explanation of an expression in English. And every single native speaker of Chinese who reads that sentence will know that this is not something we say in Chinese. And is that a problem in this case? No, it isn't, because it's just there to reflect or show what the English means. Is it a problem in your case? Yes, it is, because you are reading this text with a different purpose in mind. I actually wrote about this problem in general in an earlier article called Can You Use English Learning Materials to Study Chinese? And the answer is usually no. This doesn't mean that all translations are bad as learning materials. I've read many books translated into Chinese, and I think that can be a very good way. For example, if you read a novel that you've read in English and then you read a Chinese version, that might actually work, but note the difference here. The Chinese version of a novel, if it's translated from English, like an officially published translation, is meant to be enjoyable in Chinese for a Chinese audience, whereas the text in your book does not have that purpose, and that reflects the language usage. Obviously, there are also translations that are just outright bad, and that can be because sometimes the translator is not very good, but usually it's probably because translators don't get paid very much and they might write too quickly or they get paid by word or something. So what I'm saying is that if you're dealing with texts in this category, translations, learner-oriented text or anything like this, do check them with a native speaker and see what they say. If they okay it, then it's probably fine, and that will be the case with most of these texts we're talking about. But sometimes you will stumble into official translations of novels that are just not very good in Chinese. as a beginner or an intermediate learner or even an advanced learner, it can be very hard to tell, so do check. Okay, so that was just a very long-winded way of saying, no, you shouldn't read that text. And in general then, to everybody, if you're dealing with translated texts, i.e. a text originally written in English and you're reading it in Chinese, parallel text, or anything that has a very specific purpose in mind that isn't exactly what you're doing, make sure to check it with a native speaker. Usually it's fine, but not always. Okay, so that means we're through the 3 questions. It took a little bit longer than I thought, but I hope you have enjoyed these answers and find them helpful. And if you've listened this far, like I said in the introduction, I would appreciate it greatly if you were willing to share the podcast and recommend it to your friends, or if you'd be willing to leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Of course, if you have any questions for the next Q&A session, and hopefully it won't be a year from now, you can send them to editor@hackingchinese.com. Here's to another year of the Hacking Chinese podcast. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.